Welcome to this explainer. Okay, we are jumping right in today because we're unpacking a truly fascinating paradox buried deep inside human psychology. We're going to be looking at how the very psychological defenses we built to protect ourselves can actually end up becoming our cages. It's a really compelling look at self-sabotage, vulnerability, and honestly the incredible lengths our own minds will go to just to keep us exactly where we are. To start things off, I want you to really think about this question for a second. Why do highly intelligent people often use their brilliant minds to avoid real change? It's a pretty striking pattern when you notice it. Instead of doing the raw, uncomfortable, messy work of personal growth, smart people will frequently just spin these massive, elaborate theories about their problems. They analyze, they deconstruct, they theorize. But as we're going to see today, all that brilliant analysis might just be a highly sophisticated way of standing completely still.
All right, let's dive into this. Consider this the visual foundation for our entire explainer. This is a hand-drawn exercise from a moral recognition therapy, or MRT, notebook. It's called the Pyramid of Life. Now look, at first glance, it just looks like a page of crude kindergarten-level stick figures. But definitely do not let that simplicity fool you. These shaky little lines actually function as a profound, high-resolution psychological map of a person's entire life.
So how do we read this map? Well, we have to look at its structure. The pyramid works by mapping a person's life across 5 very specific temporal tiers. Up at the very top apex, you've got the present or now. Then, as the pyramid widens and descends, it takes us back in time, 1 year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, all the way down to that base tier, which represents 20-plus years ago, basically childhood. And notice how the pyramid is split right down the middle. The left side charts the factual path, what actually happened in real life, while the right side tracks the counterfactual, what could have been if completely different choices were made. And this setup brilliantly illustrates a contrast right at the apex, present day. On the factual real-life side, the subject literally drew themselves as an armored knight. They've got a sword, they're carrying a shield, they are totally defended. But then look over at the counterfactual side, the alternative present. The figure stands totally unarmed, no weapons, with their arms thrown completely open. It is such a stark visual rhyme. One reality is defended, rigid, and totally isolated, while the potential alternative life is defined by vulnerability, openness, and connection. And as we trace this timeline down, the contrast hits even harder through these recurring architectural motifs. The most powerful one here is the window. On the factual side, at both the 1-year and 10-year marks, the window is drawn with prison bars. It's this heavy symbol of confinement and self-imposed isolation. But on the counterfactual side, that exact same window frame is totally transformed. The bars just vanish, and they're replaced by a smiling face and some flowers on the sill. An instrument of confinement literally becomes an aperture of domestic peace. Okay, so what is actually driving this factual path of isolation and heavy armor? The source material brings up this stunning core realization: the economy of self-loathing. According to this framework, self-loathing isn't just a symptom or some tragic affliction that happens to you. It is a highly functional system. It's essentially a psychological protection racket you run on yourself, where guilt is literally used as currency to buy permission to stay exactly the same. Let's break down exactly how this internal economy operates, because this is absolutely crucial to understand. Think of personal growth as a terrifying financial loan. In this model, guilt functions entirely as the interest on your moral debt. By constantly sitting around feeling bad about your choices, you are simply making the minimum interest payment. You pay that interest of guilt so that you never ever have to retire the principal debt. Because retiring the principal, that would mean making actual terrifying behavioral changes. So we literally use that heavy, terrible feeling of guilt to indefinitely delay the raw, hard work of actually growing. So the real kicker here is that self-loathing becomes a psychological permit. It's a license for hedonism or self-sabotage. The logic plays out like this. If you believe you are fundamentally a worthless person, well, then your indulgences and your mistakes are effectively prepaid. And this creates a perfectly closed loop. The loathing justifies the indulgence generates the guilt, and then the guilt just confirms the loathing. The whole system spins indefinitely without ever requiring you to change a single thing or risk any actual intimacy. Which brings us right back to our armored knight at the top of the pyramid, and to one of the most incredibly powerful insights in this analysis. The knight guards a self it doesn't believe is worth guarding. The defense and the contempt are the same act. Think about that. The armor isn't there to protect some precious, vulnerable inner child from a harsh world. No, the armor is there to keep people out so they can't see the person inside. Because if someone actually got in and truly loved them, it would disconfirm their worthlessness. It would completely collapse their entire protection racket. But that begs the question, how do highly intelligent people manage to keep this racket going without realizing it? Well, they use a very specific mechanism called intellectualization. For someone who is deeply wired for depth and systems thinking, intellect becomes the ultimate, most elegant armor you could ask for. Instead of actually feeling the raw pain of that isolation, the mind creates distance by turning the pain into a fascinating, complex puzzle to be solved. Let's walk through exactly how this builds. The sources map out this exact chain of intellectualization. It's a literal chain reaction. It starts with a raw emotion, which obviously triggers internal discomfort. To escape that discomfort, the mind pivots to intellectualization. It generates these incredibly complex explanations and relies heavily on abstract language. And the ultimate result? Complete, total distance from the lived experience. Complexity bias convinces us that if an explanation is complicated, it must be smarter. But really, complexity is just acting as a massive shield against direct emotional contact. And the wildest part? The source materials actually demonstrate this exact phenomenon playing out in real time between the author and an AI. There is this hilarious meta-ironic disproportion here. The author drew basic kindergarten-level stick figures of a knight and a jail cell, and in response, the AI generated a 2,500-word hyper-intellectual dissertation about self-organizing moral economies and monetizing guilt. The ratio of ink to analysis is staggering. The response literally proves the point of the defense mechanism, taking something incredibly simple and burying it under mountains of complex theory. Look, being analytical is an extraordinary tool, for sure. But what this explainer really highlights is how sophistication becomes a massive trap when it just dresses up self-sabotage as deep psychological insight. You can become an absolute expert analyst of your own pain. You can sit there and admire the beautiful architectural rhyme of the barred windows in your own psychological cage. But analyzing the cage is definitely not the same thing as walking through the open door. Which brings us to the absolute climax of this whole analysis, hitting us with the ultimate meta-joke. The core question the source asks is simply this: do you actually change, or do you just get more interesting about not changing? Are you actually doing the work, or are you just using your immense self-awareness to make your refusal to grow sound incredibly fascinating? Because, as long as you are the one holding the frame, interpreting and intellectualizing your own behavior, that armor stays firmly on. The real shift only happens when you step completely out of that intellectual loop and hand the frame over to someone else. So I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought to take away from this explainer. What does it actually cost you to drop the armor, stop trying to be interesting, and just embrace the plain, unarmored truth?